Hi, my name is Dr. Paul T. Carter. Thank you for joining me from Bangkok. Today I'm going to tell you the story of how the CIA, after World War II, found a clandestine war capability on the plain, prairie, and mountains of the American Northwest. In 1951, the CIA sent two operatives to 9 Mile, Montana, to the Smokejumpers base there to undergo parachute training. Now, the Smokejumpers are those American Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management men and women who exit aircraft while in flight to combat forest fires. Now, when the CIA operatives completed their parachute training and returned to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, they apparently told the CIA there was no reason to send anyone back out there for training because the capability that the CIA was looking for was already resident in the Smokejumper community. So that year, in 1951, the CIA hired 10 Smokejumpers for operations. 7 of them went to Taiwan to help train Taiwanese nationalist forces. As far as the other 3, it's not sure where they went. You see, this is history that's still being written, history that's still being uncovered. So what was it about Smokejumpers that appealed to the CIA? First, Smokejumpers understood parachute operations, and that is more than just people jumping out of planes. I mean rigging cargo such as food, weapons, logistics of various types, and dropping it from planes so that it landed intact. That in itself is both an art and science, to successfully parachute cargo from the air to the ground, have it land accurately, and in fact, one could argue it's more dangerous than jumping itself because it is a hazardous task and people get killed pushing cargo from a plane. Secondly, Smokejumpers were rugged, independent, willing to accept risk and danger, and maybe more importantly, they had the ability to adequately adapt to rapidly changing hazardous situations. Additionally, they were not active-duty military personnel, so Smokejumpers provided some U.S. government plausible deniability. Now, the U.S. Army a decade earlier had learned of Smokejumper operations. If you are or were Army Airborne, you should know of General William Lee, the father of U.S. military airborne operations. In June 1940, he was in Missoula, Montana, observing the Smokejumper program. In a quote from the Missoula Sentinel newspaper after the war, General Lee, quote, told the world that the Forest Service parachute training assignments and experiments had stepped up or speeded Army parachute developments by 6 months, unquote. The CIA was impressed with this capability, obviously, so it began deploying Smokejumpers around the world. Sadly, almost 10% of the Smokejumper deployers gave their lives in support of these foreign operations, which is a very high mortality rate. So now to the topic. Here is the agenda we will follow. I'll show you the history of smoke jumping in the U.S., how it began, then a quick snippet about smoke jumpers today. Finally, we'll get into the meat of the subject, smoke jumpers in support of CIA operations. And by the way, I'll tell you about a few other notable smoke jumpers in national service who were not associated with the CIA. One went to the moon in 1971, another was a pioneering Mount Everest climber, and, as I will show you, a crew of B-17 smoke jumpers saved James Bond in one of 007's movies. Now I'm going to show you a short condensed video from the National Smoke Jumper Association that takes you from the initial U.S. Forest Service rejection in the 1930s of jumping into fires to the development of the program and the first season.
In 1886, the government created the Division of Forestry to administer timber and fire protection. At that time, Army soldiers were used to put out fires. 1910 was the worst fire season in recorded history for the Pacific Northwest. A firestorm destroyed 4 million acres. 80 people died. Fire became a holy war for the young Forest Service. Following World War I, the Army Air Corps was enlisted to fly fire patrols. By 1925, aerial patrols covered nearly all of the western forests. 5 years later, improvements in technology made it possible to parachute supplies to the fire crews on the ground. Only 30 years after the Wright brothers, the airplane and parachute had transformed forest firefighting. But for those who believed the logical next step was to parachute men into fires, that logic didn't get off the ground with some in the Forest Service.
I'm willing to take a chance on most any kind of a proposition that promises better action on forest fires. But the best information that I can get from experienced flyers is that all parachute jumpers are more or less crazy, just a little bit unbalanced. Very sincerely yours, Evan Kelly, Regional Forester.
The idea of parachuting firefighters was quickly abandoned as too risky. But each summer, the fires came again.
Usually it took you all day or part of the night to get to a fire, you know, way back in the hills there. And that was, the time you got there, you done pretty well had in a couple of days' work before you got there.
We'd have a fire reported maybe in 20 or 25 miles. By the time we hiked the crew back, the fire would probably meet them halfway.
A former forest guard named David Godwin started his career walking into forest fires. In 1935, he was put in charge of the new Aerial Fire Control Experimental Project. It began with a failed experiment, using water and chemical bombs to suppress fires. Along the way, the Forest Service bought its first airplane, a 5-passenger Stinson Reliant. In 1939, the project was moved to a small dirt airstrip near Winthrop, Washington. Money from the aerial project was used in a parachute experiment. It was a remarkable decision. Not even the U.S. military had put this much faith in parachutes. At the time the decision was made, Captain Harold King, pilot of the Forest Service airplane, was the only one present with parachute experience. He had one jump. The Eagle Parachute Company was selected to provide the parachutes. They came to Winthrop with a colorful group of barnstormers and professional jumpers. The man charged with the responsibility of finding a safe, practical method of dropping men onto forest fires was Frank Derry. Others who joined the project were Glenn Smith, an exhibition jumper and rigger, and Frank's brothers, Chester and Virgil Derry. 2 local men were hired, Dick Tuttle and Alan Honey. Neither had ever parachuted.
They came to see me, and I said, well, I'll come out and talk to you. And I came out here, and 15 minutes after I got here, I was up and down.
Jumping into wilderness forest fires presented a great many challenges to overcome. The first was to develop protective clothing and equipment suitable for landing in trees, rocky areas, and other hazardous conditions. Procedures had to be developed to cope with every possible contingency. It was all new and being done for the first time. There was a lot of trial and error, but here, errors can kill. There were many frustrating, agonizing decisions for these pioneers.
Virgil Derry got banged up pretty good into a tree before they got the masks on him, you know. Skinned the side of his face up pretty good.
Step by step, the new aerial firefighter emerged. 2 Eagle parachutes, a 30-foot steerable main parachute, and a 27-foot emergency chest pack. A 2-piece padded jumpsuit with a high collar. A large leg pocket for a tree letdown rope. And orange streamers to signal from the ground to the airplane. A leather football helmet fitted with a wire mesh face mask. Finally, gloves, logger-style boots, and a knife for cutting away entangled parachute lines. Near the end of the 6-week project, Lufkin and 4 other Forest Service employees were invited to jump. They enthusiastically accepted. One of those parachutists, Walt Anderson, gave the new aerial firefighters a name, Smokejumpers. After 58 jumps and no serious injuries, the experiment was declared a success, and plans were made to test the concept fighting fires in 1940.
They weren't really in favor of it. There was a question of whether people should parachute jump to fires for a long time. And so the people were doing it, were under the gun there.
It would have just taken one foul up on that thing and the program would have ended.
Right from the beginning, the parachute project seemed to attract the kind of people unwilling to accept failure.
The first year that we worked, we had real tough guys that, and they had to be in order to stay in the outfit.
The project was founded on the principle that a rapid initial attack on a fire would allow 2 smoke jumpers to accomplish the work of many men walking into the same fire hours later. Money was tight for the new project. The budget called for 2 smoke jumper bases, one at Winthrop, Washington, and the other at Seeley Lake, Montana. Each base was to hire 8 men. Candidates had to have firefighting experience, be in good physical condition, 21 to 25 years old, and a single male. Pay was $193 a month. There was no shortage of applicants. Frank Derry was the chief trainer for both bases. Derry had an unheard of 175 parachute jumps. Training lasted about 10 days. It was split between the classroom, training units, and physical conditioning. Then came the first jumps.
They told me now, count to 4, I think, before you pull the ripcord. And I thought, oh, God, am I traveling? I was going so fast, you know. And, of course, when I jerked that ripcord, I jerked her, what I mean. Then when that eagle opened up, boy, it put in your snapped your neck, it seemed like. And it sure did hit you hard.
Because of the budget, both bases shared the same plane, a Curtiss Travelair, on contract from the Johnson Flying Service. The base at Winthrop limped through a quiet fire season with a crew of 4. The Seeley Lake base had 9 jumpers. On July 12th, about 2 o'clock, the first fire call came in. It was a 2-acre fire near the head of Martin Creek in the Nez Perce National Forest. Rufus Robinson and Earl Cooley were at the top of the jump list.
We left Moose Creek and went up over Martin Creek. There was too much wind, really. We wouldn't jump in it after that at all, but Ruf and I decided, oh God, we was going to jump.
In those days, each jumper spotted himself. Robinson jumped early and landed short of the jump spot.
When I jumped out, and the wind was blowing so darn hard that it just twisted me right up like that. Finally, I said, well, goddamn, I got to go for my emergency. So as soon as I bent my head over to look for my emergency, that thing began to unwind up there, and it unwound and it come out full open. I hit into this big spruce tree. They told us in training not to grab any limbs, but I grabbed some limbs.
In danger of falling out of the tree, Cooley held onto the limbs, tied off his rope, and made a letdown 90 feet to safety. On the first paracargo run, the drop was far from the jump spot. Unknown to Cooley and Robinson on the ground, the cargo kicker, Merle Lundegren, nearly became a fatality. Merle Lundegren didn't go back up in a plane for the rest of the season, and as the project leader, he decided cargo kickers should wear parachutes. The first smoke jumper fire was declared controlled at 10 a.m. the next morning. 3 days later, Chester Derry made the first rescue jump when a Johnson Flying Service Travelair crashed, killing the pilot and injuring the passenger. Ironically, it was the same plane used in smoke jumper training. The jump season ended with a combined 12 fire jumps for the 2 bases.
There are 9 smoke jumper bases in the western U.S. You know, as far north as Fairbanks, Alaska, as furthest southern base is probably Northern California, but we do have sub-bases. We have one in Silver City, New Mexico, not too far from the border. Missoula and Boise are the 2 biggest bases. They fluctuate between 70 and 80. Some of the smaller bases, Winthrop and West Yellowstone, have 25, 30 jumpers. It just depends on the demand. Here is the ready room. There's roughly 75 lockers in here. This is when the siren goes off, you come in here, get your jumpsuit on, harness and parachutes, and then you get your check, make sure all your gear's in order, and then you're on the plane within 10 minutes.
World War II greatly reduced the availability of men to fight fires, but the mission continued with skeletal crews, and so did the fires. America had conscientious objectors then, as it does in every war, and the U.S. Forest Service found around 220 conscientious objectors during 1943 to 45 who volunteered to serve America in another way, as smoke jumpers. By all accounts, they earned their colleagues' respect for their bravery and service. One salty smoke jumper remarked to the effect, quote, "Once these Mennonites put their head down, the sons of bitches didn't stop until the work was done," unquote. In early 1945, the 555 Parachute Infantry Battalion, or Triple Nickel, an all-black U.S. Army battalion in Operation Firefly, was sent to Pendleton Air Base, Pendleton, Oregon, about 200 of them, while 100 of them were sent to Chico, California, to combat two threats. One, forest fires, the other, balloon bombs that the Japanese streamed across the Pacific to land in the western U.S., one killing a mother and 5 children near Bly, Oregon in May 1945. The Triple Nickel soon found itself successfully fighting blazes across the western U.S., and the unit's record in 1945 as airborne soldier firefighters became another chapter in the unit's storied history. Now, the CIA and smoke jumper connection. As I mentioned, in 1951, the CIA recruited smoke jumpers for operations in Taiwan. The communists had just taken over mainland China in 1949, nationalist Chinese had fled to Taiwan, and the Taiwanese and CIA were conducting clandestine operations against the Chinese mainland. Now, how did the CIA know to send operatives to smoke jumper training in 1951? And was this actually the first connection between the CIA and smoke jumpers? Well, maybe not. Loren Fessler became a smoke jumper in 1946. During World War II, he had served in the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, forerunner of the CIA in Europe and China. So almost certainly while in China, Fessler worked with Chiang Kai-shek's anti-communist nationalist forces. Loren graduated from Harvard with a degree in the Chinese language, was a freelance journalist for the New York Times in Taiwan, and went on to become one of Time magazine's chief China watchers, both in Hong Kong and Macau. Fessler may have initiated the first connection. It was also recently learned that a smoke jumper, Clem Pope, who trained at the Cave Junction Smoke Jumper Training Base in 1946, also served with the OSS in China. Whatever the first link between the CIA and smoke jumpers, it started a steady stream of smoke jumpers in CIA service. The American smoke jumpers in Taiwan trained Chiang Kai-shek's Taiwanese units in survival techniques and parachute operations to prepare them for being dropped into mainland China, and assisted with the actual airdrops over the mainland. One smoke jumper, Jack Matthews, who had a 27-year career with the CIA, actually jumped with the Taiwanese during one assault, according to one unverified account. Here are smoke jumpers with the Republic of China, President Chiang Kai-shek and his First Lady, Madame Chiang. Herman Ball, who received his training from Missoula Base his rookie year in 1950. Jack Matthews, who I just mentioned, Missoula, 1948. Jack Wall, also Missoula, 1948. Gar Thorsrud, who would later head the CIA's Intermountain Aviation in Arizona, and Lyle Greninger, Missoula, 1948. In 1957, the CIA began planning for another clandestine effort called Operation Barnum, which was the CIA's support for Tibetan nationalists during their revolution against the People's Republic of China. 10 smoke jumpers were known to have worked on this operation. Aircraft operations originating from Ta Kli Royal Air Base in Thailand, dropping supplies into Tibet. There were approximately 40 flights from 1960 to 1962. One of the more soon-to-be famous smoke jumpers on these operations was the legendary Jerry Daniels, who I'll talk about shortly. In addition to the flight support, the CIA hired smoke jumpers, trained Tibetans at Camp Hale, Colorado, and for jump operations at Fort Carson, Colorado. Camp Hale was chosen for its high altitude and rugged terrain. Now, smoke jumpers did not work for the CIA 365 days per year. In fact, the typical pattern was that many would return to the firefighting during the summer months, the fire season. Individuals were good at keeping their service to the CIA a secret, But word obviously got around from one smoke jumper to another because that's who the CIA wanted for employment. Another difficulty keeping this a secret was that it was hard for a smoke jumper to claim at the start of the spring fire season that he'd been wintering in his snowbound cabin in Montana tending to his ranch when he sported a tropical tan from Vietnam or had a mild case of trench foot from Laos. Regarding smoke jumper to smoke jumper contact and recruiting, the Conboy and Morrison book on the CIA's Tibetan operations mentions smoke jumpers frequently. Here's a quote. With time pressing, the CIA returned in the fall of 1958 to the smoke jumper community. The September rains had brought an abrupt end to the summer fire season in the western United States, and many were readily available. From Washington, Gar Thorsrud asked his brother, who was smoke jumper Ed Thorsrud, himself a smoke jumper in Missoula, Montana, to contact 3 colleagues for the sensitive assignment. In short order, Roland Andy Anderson, William Demmons, and Ray Shank were in the nation's capital for a security check and briefing. It was perfect, remembers Anderson, because we could do Asian operations during the winter and spring, then be home for smoke jumping in the summer, unquote.
This is the battlefield in Laos.
From 1965 to 1973, scores of smoke jumpers worked for the CIA in Laos during the U.S. secret war there. This is one of the most written about episodes involving smoke jumpers because I personally don't know a book about the U.S. secret war in Laos that doesn't mention individually smoke jumpers by name. Unfortunately, this is the war theater where most of the smoke jumpers died. In Laos, smoke jumpers served as CIA pilots for CIA proprietary airlines such as Continental and Air America, as operations officers, and as kickers, those who delivered cargo from the air. The air war in Laos required robust air operations, more so than a conventional war in another country, because Laos was so mountainous and lacked good roads or even a railroad. Thus, U.S. allies such as the Royal Lao, Hmong, and Thai had to be provisioned and supported, which includes medical evacuation, through CIA helicopter and fixed-wing support. Hundreds of small landing strips and bases throughout Laos were dependent upon CIA air operations, smoke jumpers being the essential crew for these aircraft delivering the supplies. A group of smoke jumpers also trained the Thai Special Operations Police, Peru, at Pitsanulok camp in neighboring Thailand. Others worked in CIA air operations in neighboring Vietnam. One of the most celebrated smoke jumpers to have served in Laos was Jerry Daniels, who became a legend for his CIA activities in Laos. From Montana, he was a rodeo rider and a state wrestling and chess champion. In 1961, Jerry was hired as a kicker by Air America, contracted to drop supplies to Vang Pal's Hmong troops in Laos. After dropping cargo in Laos and Tibet, Jerry returned to the U.S. in 1962 to work for Intermountain Aviation, the CIA proprietary, at Marana Air Park, Arizona. The reason Jerry was so celebrated was that he gave his heart and soul to the U.S. effort in Laos and to the Hmong people who fought against the communists. The Hmong in America honor him today with a reverence that very few people in life are bestowed. He became fluent in their language and was on one of the last flights out of Laos on the last day of evacuating Hmong refugees in 1975. Afterwards, he became a resettlement officer with the U.S. State Department Refugee Program in Thailand and helped many a worthy Hmong in Laos who had fought for the U.S. come to America. Jerry was a recipient of the CIA's second, third, and fourth highest medals, and sadly, in 1982, he died of carbon monoxide poisoning in his apartment in Bangkok. The Hmong in America created a story cloth in 1991 depicting Hmong important life events. The event at the top of the cloth is Daniel's funeral. As a whole, in CIA employment, smoke jumpers served as pilots, kickers, trainers, paratroopers, cargo riggers, and police trainers, while a dozen became full-time CIA case officers. The countries or regions they served in or supported operations for were, and these are just the ones we know, the Arctic, Caribbean, the Congo, Cyprus, Guam, Guatemala, India, Indonesia, Iran, the CIA secret base in Arizona called Marana Air Park, Nicaragua, Tibet, Thailand, and Vietnam, in operations ranging from the Bay of Pigs invasion training to rescuing American scientists. 4 of the stars on the CIA's Wall of Honor are smoke jumpers. An amazing story involving smoke jumpers was the CIA Project/Operation Cold Feet.
May 1961. A U.S. naval aircraft conducting an aeromagnetic survey over the Arctic Ocean spots a Soviet research station in the ice pack below. This was North Pole 9, one in a series of mysterious scientific colonies built by the Soviet government to further their exploration of the remote Arctic. The purpose of these stations was unknown at the time, and the prospect of infiltrating one was immediately intriguing to U.S. intelligence. The challenge would be how to access NP-9, as it was buried too far into the impenetrable Arctic ice to reach by boat or helicopter. Landing an airplane on the unstable ice pack was out of the question. The CIA, however, was undeterred. It would take a year of planning and extreme training to launch one of the agency's most daring missions of the Cold War.
The Navy enlisted the help of the intelligence community and approached Intermountain, headed by former smoke jumper Gar Thorsrud, who I mentioned earlier. A decision was made to drop 2 operatives onto the abandoned station and later retrieve them by a specially equipped B-17 aircraft fitted with a human retrieval system called a Fulton Skyhook. This Fulton Skyhook system had been tested before in picking up personnel and worked, but had never been used in an actual operation. This is where Intermountain Aviation came into play. Starting in early 1962, Intermountain Aviation began preparing the B-17 and Skyhook system. The way the retrieval worked is that a huge helium balloon was floated in the air with a rope attached to a human below. The B-17, as it was flying, would hook onto the rope, securing the human who would be winched into the airplane. So 2 operatives were parachuted to the abandoned Soviet ice station and 7 days later were successfully retrieved. The smoke jumper contribution was not just from Thorsrud, who headed Intermountain Aviation, but the smoke jumpers who worked on the project. Also, smoke jumpers Toby Scott, Bob Nickel, Jerry Daniels, Miles Johnson, and Jack Wall flew on the extraction mission. Here is the route the plane took from Fairbanks and Point Barrow, Alaska to the Arctic, and then an eastern route on the exfil. Here you see Jerry Daniels far left at Point Barrow as part of the mission. The mission was such a success in both terms of information gathered and the retrieval of the 2 operatives that in April 2008 the CIA held a medal ceremony for surviving crew members and relatives of deceased crew members, and this painting of the operation, entitled 7 Days in the Arctic by Keith Woodcock, was unveiled and now hangs in the headquarters lobby. In 1963, the system was again used in the Arctic with the same crew of smoke jumpers. An American scientist at the Arliss Arctic Research Station had become sick, and Intermountain Aviation launched from Marana to Fairbanks, Alaska, for extraction. Now, when the scientist learned how he was going to be extracted, he said something to the effect, and I paraphrase here, "Hell no." So the B-17 and crew turned around, returned to Marana Air Park in Arizona. Now, unfortunately, a week later, the scientist died. So it was determined he would be extracted by the B-17. So at the appointed date and time, Old George, as the smoke jumpers kindly come to call him, was rigged with a rope and a helium balloon up in the air. Now the smoke jumpers, being the kind lot that they are, decided that they would do something for the scientist on the ground. So they rigged 2 jugs of gin to parachute to the scientist. Now, That day, at the appointed time and pickup, there was cloud cover, so the B-17 crew could not see the ground. They could just see the helium balloon. Likewise, the scientists could not see the B-17. They could just hear it approaching and fly over. Now, the scientists on the ground described something as if it was like a manifestation from God. They said, slowly as the airplane was flying over, they saw Old George ascend up into the clouds. And then descending from the clouds were 2 jugs of gin. It was like manna from heaven. Now, I'm going to show you a clip of a B-17 in operation. You will actually recognize one of the passengers being picked up, and the air crew were smoke jumpers. Unfortunately, it was inevitable that some smoke jumpers would perish in this line of dangerous activity, just as some did fighting forest fires. The secret war in Laos claimed several smoke jumper lives. Smoke jumper Jean de Bruin was shot down over Laos in 1963 and parachuted from the flaming Air America C-46. He became a communist Pathet Lao prisoner of war for 3 years, and then, with several other prisoners, conducted the largest prison camp break of the Second Indochina War. The prisoners separated into groups after the escape. A few were rescued, perhaps the most famous being Navy Lieutenant Dieter Dingler, who later wrote a book about his experiences, which was turned into a movie, Rescue Dawn. Sadly, Jean de Bruin remains missing in action. Other smoke jumpers who gave their lives in CIA service overseas were Darrell Eubanks, Dave Bevan, John Lewis, Gideon Newton, Billy Hester, Ed Weissenbach, Frank Odom, and Tom Diefenbach. Several smoke jumpers have gone on to notable careers outside the CIA. While I can't provide you the full list here, smoke jumper Willie Unsold became a world-renowned mountain climber. Smoke jumper Stuart Rusa was one of only 24 men to visit the moon. He served in nearly every position available to a NASA astronaut and landed on the moon as the command module pilot for Apollo 14. This 1971 moon landing is often remembered because it was where Alan Shepard famously swung a golf club. At least one smoke jumper, George K. Sisler, became a Medal of Honor winner, our nation's highest military award. You Army military intelligence types will know Sisler Hall at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, named after him.
During the late 60s and 70s, the war in Vietnam began to impact smoke jumper operations. Many of the jumpers were of draft age and facing military service. An uncounted number of smoke jumpers served in the Vietnam War. Notable was George Kenneth Sisler, who jumped out of Winthrop. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in 1967. Lieutenant Sisler was mortally wounded while rescuing 2 of his men. He continued to lead his unit till he died of his wounds. Many returning Vietnam veterans found it very natural to go back into smoke jumping.
Smoke jumping was the closest thing to war you could get without guns. It had it all. There was the action, the movement, the noise, the excitement, the danger, except nobody had guns. So I didn't have any trouble coming home. I went back to smoke jumping.
We had guys at Cave Junction who were conscientious objectors. We had guys who objected to the war period, and we had guys that were coming back from Vietnam. And they were all mixed together, and that kind of busted up the teamwork that we had.
Several smoke jumpers became U.S. Air Force and CIA pilots. One, Gene Hamner, became one of the legendary Raven pilots, the secret forward air control pilots during the U.S. war in Laos.
And it was 3 months later that I actually got a call to go to the Ravens. And I reported to the 1st Detachment of the 56th Special Operations Wing, and my briefing with the commander of the squadron there started out and was just exactly what I was looking for. He said, "You're going to go, but the first thing you're going to do when you finish briefing here is you're going to go back to your room, take off your uniform, put on civilian clothes, pack anything military up except your ID, and ship it home." And he said, when you get to Vientiane and the embassy, they'll take your ID card and they'll give you a embassy card to carry instead. And then he went on kind of generally describing what was expected of me. All of my years of working with the Forest Service, doing topographic maps in college and reading maps out over fires and various things that I worked with the Forest Service, reading a map, finding targets, visualizing what the enemy would do, how they could move things down trails or off roads, and where they would look for paths. I mean, it all, topographical map is like reading a book. It made infinite sense to me. And you're taking people like this, you're taking their uniform away, you're telling them, here's an airplane, go up and fight this war. Your objective is to work with the Hmong, the Laotian, whatever group, and do the best job you can. Don't call us, we'll call you.
It's appropriate to also honor the late great McAllen Thompson. The following pictures represent Mac's lead role in charity work on behalf of TLCB in Laos from 2007 to 2018. The TLCB mission continues. Mac was from Oregon, a friend of the Smoke Jumpers, fought fires in the Northwest, and got a degree in forestry from Oregon State. He was a U.S. Army lieutenant in Thailand in the early 1960s, was in Laos from 1966 to 1975 with the State Department mission, and then conducted refugee relief with Jerry Daniels in Bangkok after the war. Mac, along with heroes such as Lionel Rosenblatt, are almost singularly responsible for the success story of the Hmong in America. Mac and famous author Roger Warner were two of the first Westerners to return to the secret CIA and Hmong base in Longcheng, Laos in 2006, which this video shows.
In March 2006, my friend Mac Thompson and I decided to try to get into the valley of Longcheng in northeastern Laos. It had been the upcountry headquarters for the so-called Secret War, but for 30 years it had been off limits to foreigners.
There's a lot of work that could be done here with the schools, the 2 school buildings, the small warehouse office building, virtually falling down, and the other old USAID funded school that has fallen down completely. Could use a lot of work.
Mac helped thousands of people and knew more about the Lao War than anyone, according to both Jim Mule Parker and the renowned humanitarian Dr. Charles Weldon. I was blessed to have Mac as my mentor, traveling to Laos with him 9 times. He is a legend and sorely missed. If you want to read more Smoke Jumper stories, and in fact everything I talk about here in more detail and other things I haven't mentioned, Articles are available in the National Smokejumper magazine, available online, and I highly recommend this book, Smokejumpers and the CIA, or their 2-hour DVD on their history, which is exceptional. The proceeds from the book and DVD go to the National Smokejumpers Association. Lee Gossett has written Smokejumper 2 Global Pilot. Also, Eastern Washington University has built a Smokejumper digital archive. Many additional books and national security documents contain anecdotes about Smokejumpers because of their centrality to U.S. operations. For example, this declassified CIA document on the proposed Bay of Pigs operation says Gar Thorsrud was assigned as the acting chief of the air section. His name is mentioned over 80 times in the document. If you are in the Missoula, Montana area, I highly recommend you visit the Missoula Smokejumper Visitor Center. I want to thank Chuck Sheely, Fred Rohrbach, and Captain Lee Gossett for helping me with this project, particularly Chuck, the editor of Smokejumper magazine. Smokejumpers agree, without Chuck's historical research and dogged persistence in detailing Smokejumper history, their stories would not be chronicled.